There are 4 worksheets to go with this course, and you can download them at the link below. When you download them, I suggest you look at them on your computer, and you may find it helpful to use the magnifying function, especially with the first sheet, which is a little unclear at the top. This is a 4-part course, however part 2 is divided into 2 sections. Good afternoon, students, and welcome to this short course on how to describe data in diagrams. This course is aimed primarily at the IELTS Writing Task 1. However, it will also be very useful for anyone who has to make a verbal or written report of data presented in diagrammatic form. There are certain skills you need to do this task. In particular, there are special vocabulary and mathematical skills, as well as developing the ability to pick out important information. So let's start by looking at the text at the top of the page. Take some time to read these points yourself first. So maybe you might like to pause the audio for a while. And I would also like to apologize at this point for some of this text being not very clear. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to get a clearer copy. So pause the audio now. So looking at the first sentence, the first thing you have to do is to analyze the diagram carefully, identify important information. We will talk more about this skill later. Try to avoid repetition, try to use many different words, and in the box below you will find a list of words which will help you to not be repetitive. Begin with an introductory statement. You can refer to the name of this kind of diagram. It may be a table, a line graph, a bar chart, a pie chart, or you can just refer to it generally as a diagram. Then you should say what it shows. As always, when you are introducing any topic, whether it is written or verbal, you need to tell your audience right at the beginning what it is about. So if we look at the graph at the bottom of the page, how would you describe this? Pause the audio for a moment and think about how you would introduce this graph. You should be aware there is not only one way of describing the information. So let me give you the way I would describe this. I would say this line graph shows the consumption of 3 different kinds of fatty foods between the years 1971 to 1997. Usually the introduction is going to be 1 sentence, but sometimes there may be 2 or even 3 diagrams, so you may need more than 1 sentence to make the introduction. The second point is, don't try to describe every detail. The very worst essay looks something like this, where the writer says 457 students drank coffee, 239 students drank water, 15 students drank milk, and so on and so on. If you report the information like this, it's going to be both very difficult for your audience to understand the relevance, and it will also get you very low marks in an examination paper. You have to develop the skill of picking out the salient points. Salient, S-A-L-I-E-N-T. I should point out here that salient can be pronounced salient or salient, but the spelling is identical. As always, if you hear any words which I think you may not understand, I will repeat and spell them, and you should check the meaning in Google or your dictionary. We will talk more later about how to pick out the most significant features of a diagram. This is going to be an extremely important skill. Next, try to express the figures in clear ways, especially using percentages, fractions, multiples. It's much better to say, for example, that 10% of students drank coffee rather than 157 students drank coffee out of 1,500. In this example, we don't really need to know the absolute figures. The percentage is really the relevant information. We should say around 10% of students drank coffee. Nearly always figures are going to be approximate, so make sure you use words like around, about, approximately when you describe numbers or figures. Don't speculate about reasons or trends. This is in the IELTS exam. You should not speculate, but if this is your own project, then speculation may well be appropriate. This will have to be your own decision. The last point here about making some suggestion about general trends, I would suggest this is not valid in IELTS. Although I have taken this from an IELTS textbook, I have rarely seen an IELTS diagram where it is either practical or appropriate to suggest what future trends may be. Diagrams nearly always show information in the past, so it would be fairly impossible to try to predict something which has already ended. Now look at the language used in the box below. This is some of the most useful language you can use to describe diagrams. And do the 6 questions above the box at letter B. Pause your audio now and try these by yourself. Okay, now you have done that, let me look at the answers I may have given. Number 1, a very small increase. We could say a slight or a marginal increase. Number 2, from 2000 until 2003, we could say between or during the period. Number 3, a steep decline. We could say a sharp, steep or rapid decline, or maybe marked or significant. Number 4, to rise quickly, we can use the same words, sharp, steep, rapid, marked or significant increase. Number 5, to reach a maximum, we can use to be at a peak or reach a peak. And number 6, to stop falling, we can say level out or remain steady. Okay, let's now look at the graph at the bottom of the page. Pause the audio for a moment while you study the graph. I want you to try to guess what words you could use to describe the changes in the consumption of butter, margarine and low-fat spreads. So pause the audio now before you listen to my answers. Okay, let's continue. Let's look at butter first. So the period until around 1975, we can see that the consumption of butter increased. We could also say that it reached a peak in around 1975. Then what happened after 1975? We can say there was a gradual decrease, tending to level off at the end of the period. Here a gradual decrease would be appropriate, but this is a matter of personal judgment, whether you think something is a gradual decrease or a rapid decrease or a significant decrease. As always, with all questions and examination questions included, a fair amount of common sense is needed in answering questions well. Now let's look at margarine. We could say there was a gradual increase in margarine until around 1985, I think. Let me look at that. Can I just say here that if you have any difficulty reading the details, you should use your magnifying tool on your computer, which is what I am doing now. So we can see margarine reached a peak at around 1984 to 1985, then began a slow decline until 1997, or until the end of the period. Now let's look at low-fat spreads. First of all, you can see that low-fat spreads were introduced around 1984, so you should make this point first of all. Low-fat spreads, which were introduced around 1984, showed a fairly steady increase throughout the period. The small fluctuations you can see here, I think, are not significant enough to try to talk about. Some other words you could use from the box in describing this diagram are at the points where margarine exceeds the consumption of butter, around 1981, and low-fat spreads exceed the consumption of butter around 1992 and exceed the consumption of margarine around 1995. Remember, if you can introduce more words, such as exceed, this is going to get you higher marks, and it will make your presentation more attractive to your audience. Okay, for the last part of this lesson, let's look at how we might describe the graph in around 150 words, which is what you are asked to write in IELTS. So pause the audio for a moment and think for yourself about how you would describe the information in this graph before you listen to my answer. Okay, let's begin. So the first thing you should do when you get any diagram is to categorize the different kinds of information you have, and then the second thing you have to do is to prioritize the information, and this will show you how to describe it in your report. So here we have actually 4 categories of information. We have butter, margarine, low-fat spreads, but we also have the total quantity of consumption per person per week. Now this last category sometimes looks confusing to students. Let me explain why this may be important. Suppose we're talking about not consumption of fat, but consumption of cigarettes per day. Suppose I describe information showing how the number of cigarettes smoked per day has changed over a 10-year period. I could say, for example, that over the 10 years until 2014, the smoking of cigarettes has reduced by 20%. This is great, but I haven't told you how many cigarettes are involved here. So this may be interesting information to the audience. How many cigarettes were smoked 10 years ago and how many cigarettes are smoked today? So sometimes you can see the information, which is usually on the vertical line regarding quantity, can be important to describe as one category of information. So you should generally have maybe one short paragraph for each category, plus a paragraph for the introduction, which may only be one sentence. So our introduction here could be: the line graph shows the consumption of 3 different kinds of fatty food between the years 1971 and 1997. That's your introductory paragraph. Second paragraph. Now you have to decide what is the most interesting piece of information about this graph. Well, it could be the reduction in the consumption of butter, which looks quite dramatic. Or it could be the increase in the consumption of low-fat spreads, which also looks quite dramatic. So you have a choice between these two. I think the increase in low-fat spreads probably looks the more significant. So maybe we will start with that. So we can see that during the period, perhaps the most significant change was the increase in the consumption of low-fat spreads, which increased from around 10 grams in 1984 to around 80 or 90 grams in 1997. We should actually also say here grams per person per week to make it clear what we are referring to. Second paragraph, butter. Butter reached its peak in around 1973, but after that showed a steady decline, plateauing out slightly at the end of the period until 1997. Around 1981, the consumption of butter fell below margarine for the first time, and around 1992 it also fell below low-fat spreads for the first time. Then the last paragraph, margarine. Margarine, we can see, had a steady increase in consumption until around 1985 to 86, and then a gradual decline, remaining more or less at the same level as in 1971. Then the last paragraph, maybe we can look at the total consumption of fatty foods. We can see that people consumed between 10 to 150 grams of one of these fatty foods per week. However, this has reduced substantially by 1997 to under 100 grams per week for all 3 types of food. I have just thought of an important point which I did not make when I was referring to butter, which is that at the beginning of the period, around 1971, butter was by far the most consumed of the 3 foods. We could say that the consumption of butter was about twice as much as the consumption of margarine at the beginning of the period. Okay, finally, this is a fairly simple graph, but I think you can see how tricky it can sometimes be to describe all the information relative to its significance. It's very easy to either miss out parts of the information or misinterpret the significance, as I did at the beginning with butter. So prior to the IELTS exam, you need to do quite a lot of practice at describing diagrams. And in the next 3 parts of this short introductory course, we will study a lot more diagrams and the skills necessary to report them. Thank you for listening, students. Goodbye.